talk about what does it mean to take a test first development. What if we can write code, but minimally only after writing a test case that fails because that code doesn't exist? But before we look at how to write test cases for React, a couple of things to really think about. When it comes to applications, we all know that we constantly change code. And when you modify a piece of code, how do you know it actually works? It worked yesterday, but we made some changes. We maybe fixed a few bugs. We made a few enhancements. Maybe we added a few new features. But how do we know if the code actually works? Well, you take the time and effort, and especially in the world of agile development and incremental development, we want to constantly be able to modify the code. Now, when you are getting these tickets, so to say, to fix bugs or to make changes, you work really hard, and you tell your boss, you tell your supervisor, you tell your team, I, I finished it. And then they ask this dreadful question that nobody likes to be asked, right? They ask you, does it work? And what's the response we often give? The beautiful response we often give is, I hope, right? And there's a technical term for I hope. That software methodology is called JDD. It stands for Jesus driven development. And we put the faith in the Lord. You can call it KDD if you wanted, Krishna driven development, or whatever you want to call it, right? Well, I don't want to put the faith in the Lord for these things. I want to actually know that the code actually works. So a really good feedback loop becomes very essential. It is especially true when some of us, a lot of us probably, work where our mistakes are fairly local. Maybe a few people around us find it, they point the mistakes, and we can fix it. But there are people who work on products where their mistakes will become visible worldwide. I was speaking at a conference incidentally on test driven development, and I spent the entire day talking to developers about automated testing. And it was pretty late in the evening. I was very tired, and I totally forgot that I had a flight early next morning, and I didn't check in for the flight. So I said, okay, let me just check into the flight before I go to bed. I could barely keep my eyes open. And I open my phone, I go to the airline's application website, and I wanted to check in for the flight. And right there, I saw dear customer and a two curly braces, and then a variable name and a curly brace. And I said to myself, that's cute. You're using Angular, I think. And I remember, just dozing off to sleep. Well, the next morning, I said to myself, oh my gosh, I remember this. Was this a dream or was it a reality? I should have taken a photo and I should have posted it on Twitter. Well, since then, I've made it a point to post on Twitter anytime I see this. And I've seen bank applications fail miserably on my site. Airline applications do the same thing. And so many other applications that are critical to what we do. So one day I tweeted saying, don't bother testing your applications. If it doesn't work, your users will tweet about it. Well, the point really is it's our professional responsibility to be sure that the code we write actually works and it's working as intended. And as the application were to change as time goes on, we want to know that it actually is still working. So this is where we really want to be able to practice test-driven development. So from that aspect, point of view, you could say that's a regression benefit. And the regression benefit is, hey, something worked before. I want to make sure it still works. It's not broken. And I want to know, so that's a good thing. But there's another benefit of writing tests before we write the code, and that is the design benefit. It actually helps us to influence the design in a way that it becomes easier to maintain the code in the long run. Now, what I mean by that is, if you have heard anybody tell you the words, right, you probably heard them say, this code, is hard to test. Well, what they are telling you in English really is the design, they are saying the design of this code sucks. That's what they really mean. So a poorly designed code is incredibly hard to test it. Now, if I give you a function which is 2,000 lines long, and I tell you to go write a test on it, you will start laughing because you only have two choices, right? To laugh or cry, and you have to choose between them. So you cannot really meaningfully write test cases with a fairly good amount of coverage on a function that's 2,000 lines long, for example, realistically speaking. So if you want testability, you're going to design the code very differently. You're going to decouple your code from the surroundings. You're going to make it cohesive and so on, and you're going to do about it. And in fact, testability is a very important criteria because if you never test what you do, you're going to have like this room. These people are sitting there happily, but they cannot see the screen. They don't care about it, even though there are empty chairs on this side. And the people who designed this room don't care about it either, right? That's the first sense we want to develop is this damn thing usable, right? If it is not usable, if it doesn't serve the users, why bother using it, right? So that's for you to take note of, right? Because I said this yesterday, and 24 hours later, we still have the same thing, right? So that's what we need to think about. Are we creating value or we just don't give a damn, right? So we need to ask that question. So for you, you can move to the empty seats on that side so you can actually see what I'm typing if you care about it. So the idea really is that we want to really be able to know that what we are creating actually works and that it is actually usable. And as we make changes, we can continue to really be able to evolve the software and know that it's working as well. Now, what I really respect is a lot of these library creators did not say testing is important, you should do it. Now, that is the beauty of what we do in our lives, right? We can always tell other people what they should do. And so they didn't say testing is really important, you should do it. They said testing is really important. We're going to make it so easy that you cannot give any meaningful excuse not to do it. And that's what I love about these tools. And one of the reasons I really like this is, oftentimes people say, oh my gosh, but this is all great. I don't have time for it. And this is one of the things that I tweeted a while ago. And my tweet basically said, I do automated testing, not because I have a lot of time. I'm going to say it is because I could say it is because I don't. So essentially, I do automated testing because I don't have a lot of time. I don't have the luxury of putting out something and then coming back and fixing it over and over and over. I want to know that I did it, it works, and I'm going to move on. That's basically what I really want to do. And for the folks who just walked in, if you want to see the screen, you're probably not going to be able to see it from there. You want to go to this side because this room is beautifully designed. So basically the idea here is that we want to be able to get that feedback. So how do we do it? So let's look at this. When you create a React application using a template, you are going to immediately get the testing files created for you with a sample test. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen projects where there's a boatload of code written and the developer either didn't touch the test file at all, or worse, they commented at that one test out and then moved on. Well, they are kind of putting this in front of us, like, please take it, right? And then we're like, I don't want that, right? So we need to really ask the question, how can we benefit from that? So let's take a look at an example here. So I don't have any code in this particular application right now, except that I just stripped out the things that were created by the scaffolding tool. So you can see that I have an app right there. And I'm going to just put a few dashes here just for us to take note of. And that's all I have in the app, as you can see. And I also removed most of the stuff from the test file also it created. So it's pretty empty, as you can see right there, or as you cannot see right there. So essentially, that's basically what we are really, seeing here. So I want to be able to just take a look at this application. So let's do an npm start on it and take a look at what it displays. And we're going to write some code into this application as we go on and be able to use it. So if you notice in this application, all you see here is a few dashes here, as you can see. That's all it contains, nothing really, right? So with that said, what are we going to do in this application? Now, typically, as you know, you are going to not put much into a top level component. You'll be putting stuff into a secondary level component, and you'll aggregate in that. And that's where you'll put most of the code. And then maybe that component will start using other components and so on. But in the test-driven development point of view, you don't want to write a code without writing a test case. This takes a lot of discipline, but it also is a skill we develop. If I go to programmers, and tell them, write this code, and they come back in a matter of hours, if not days, and say, here you go, the code works. I would go to the same programmers and I would tell them, hey, write tests before you write the code. And they would look at me and say, like, what are you kidding? How can I write tests for a code that doesn't exist? Well, the reason that is true is they just don't have the skill yet as to be able to do it. And that's exactly what it is. It's a skill. And once we develop the skill, we are able to do it. And so I was thinking about it. Why is it that people have such a difficulty writing tests before writing code? Part of the reason is a lot of us don't even know what we are going to write. And if you don't even know what you're going to write, how can you write a test for it before you write it? So prototype it, play with it. Don't put stuff into production code. If you have never, oh, here's the question I would ask you. If you have never, ever, ever done something, why would you try it the first time in your production code, right? I mean, think logic here. How many of us have put first thing, never done this code, but I'm writing it in production first? Every one of us has done it, right? And that was my experience when I graduated from college. There was a new technology. Nobody has ever written code for this ever, including me, but the rest of the world also, because it was very new. And I was like, I went to a training, I know about it. And you know how you are when you are a fresh graduate, you know everything, right? And so I said, I can do this. And I put that into production. And it didn't work. And now, of course, my boss is on my throat. Hey, is this going to work? Is this something going to work? And then to make things worse, he says, Venkat, I know you're really capable, but I'm just curious how long it's going to take. So leave me alone. I'm trying to find out why it doesn't work. But that's a lesson I learned the hard way. And ever since, anytime I come across something new, I never directly put in production. I do a prototyping. Well, that's exactly the same. If you don't know how to write a test for something, that tells you that you don't have a clue how to ever use this. So prototype, develop an example, develop a sample, play with it away from your production code. Now you know a little bit about how you would write it. With that knowledge in your mind, now you can start writing tests and writing code. Now, of course, I'm going to assume we all have written some React applications. We have written components. So what are we going to do? Well, I want the app component to talk to maybe a greet component, which is going to take care of greeting a user. So, but I want to write a greet component, but you say, wait a minute. You don't want to write a greet component yet, because you're not interested in the greet component. You're interested in the app component rendering the greet component. Now what's going to happen? You write a test to render the app component. What does the app component do? It renders the greet component. And what does the greet component do? It renders 7 other components. And what do those components do? They all send requests to the web server. And now you're down that rabbit hole, and your test that says app rendered greet doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because something 7 levels down doesn't work. My question is, why did you even go 1 level down, leave alone 7 levels down? Because your goal at this moment is not the focus of the greet component. Your focus is, does my app component render my greet component? That's all you focus on. So notice what I'm going to do now. But before I do that, one of the things I'm going to start here before that step really is to know that my environment is set up properly. Again, if I write a lot of test cases and then I come back and run my test and something is broken, now you're looking at this and saying, hey, this is not working. I don't know why it's not working. And you struggle with it for maybe several minutes. And as a person who cares about moving forward, what do you typically should do? You go to a colleague and say, I'm writing these test cases. I'm not exactly sure. Can you lend a pair of eyes? Take a look at it. What am I doing? And your colleague looks at it and says, oh, you're doing all these things you shouldn't be doing. And now you're like, no, 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 that's not the problem. I don't think it's a problem. And we are spending 10 minutes debating about what you should and should not have done. But what you failed to really know is the very, very first step. Is the environment even set up properly? If the environment is not set up properly, then what's the point in writing 20 more tests? So the very, very first thing I do when it comes to writing these test cases is to start with a test called a canary test. A canary test is the stupidest test you can ever write. And this comes from the metaphor of a canary in a coal mine. The miners would take a little bird canary into the mine, and the canary is a very active bird. It'll keep singing and playing around, and they would have it in a cage while the miners are working. And at some point, if there is a bad fume that may be injurious to the humans, well, unfortunately, before the humans inhale and start getting affected, the canary, being such a small bird, will smell the fume and will roll back and fall back and die. This is very good for the miners, not for the canary. So essentially, this is why it's called a canary test, because it's a sacrificial test. So you start by writing this canary test. So I'm going to say expect over here, I'm going to say true to be true. And that's a stupid test, isn't it? You're just telling you the test, can you please tell me that true is actually true? And so I'm going to save that right there. And I then go back here and say, let's take a look at this real quick before we go. And if you notice under the test, you can see that it says, I'm going to run the test right there. That's a script that's running it. And so as a result, I'm going to say npm test, and I'm going to run it. So when I run that test, you notice it tells me one test was written and one test passed. By the way, if your test passes, don't say I'm awesome and walk away, because you want to know really that a test is passing. I was pairing with a developer and I wrote my first test and it passed. And we wrote a little code, wrote the second test, it passed, wrote the third test, it passed, wrote the fourth test, it passed. And I wrote the fifth test and it passed. And I just looked at this and said to my person who was pairing with me, I said, I don't know about you, but I'm not that good. And he said, me neither. Well, do you think these tests are really passing? He said, I doubt it, right? And so we went and made a mistake, and the test never failed. And I felt like an idiot, right? I don't know about how he felt. He probably felt that I'm an idiot too, right? But the point is, you want to know the test is actually passing. You don't want to be fooled. So the first thing you do when you write a canary test is make it fail. And you turn it into a false. And what does it say? It says one test failed. So that's a confirmation that the test actually is running. So now that the test is passing, you can now go back and put that back to true. And you come back here and you can see that it's actually passing. So this is what you want to do, is to get the feedback that your environment actually is set up properly. And I start with a canary test. You don't write a canary test for every single test file you create, but this is the very first time you start a project, you have a canary test. Now, sometimes people ask me, hey, if I write a canary test, once I move on to writing more tests, should I remove the canary test? The answer is no, I don't. And the reason I don't remove the canary test is when I pull somebody's code on my machine and I want to run the test and my test fails, guess what's the first thing I look at? I look at the canary test. If the canary test is failing, I don't have to look at anything more because the environment is not set up properly. If the canary is passing, but other tests are failing, then maybe that's related to my application. Maybe I don't have a particular plugin I need for my application. So that is a very nice way to eliminate where the problem may be. So that's great so far. Now what are we going to do as a next step? Well, as a next step in here, I'm going to go ahead and write a test that says app renders greet. So I want to know that app actually renders greet. Now remember, in this case, I'm going to say render, And you can see that the testing library React is being used here. That's got a function called the render function. So I'm going to render the app component like so. So I'm asking it to render the app component. So once I render the app component, what do I want to know? I want to know that the app component rendered the greet component. But the question is, what does the greet component do? Maybe that renders something else, makes a call to the server, and what is the component that greet renders to? And we are going down that rabbit hole. I don't want to know, I don't care about it, because I don't care about what greet does. My focus now is that app renders greet. That's it. So I'm going to say in here, going back up here, okay, as a default, we are using jest as a library for running the test in React. So I'm going to say jest.mark, and what am I going to mark right now? I'm going to mark the dot greet is the component I'm interested in marking. So I'm telling Jest, do me a favor, when you load up this test file, completely replace for this test file the content of the greet file and replace it with what I am going to provide you here. So it doesn't matter what the greet file contains at this point, because you're going to mark it away entirely. So you are saying at this point, when the greet file is rendered, I want it to return. What do you want it to return? We can say greet mark rendered, right? So we can say greet mark rendered is what I want to return when that content of the file is rendered. So notice how trivial it is once you know why you are doing it. It's not a lot of effort to do once you know why you are doing it. Because I don't want to be drawn by that rabbit hole. I simply want to know that my app is rendering that particular component. So then I'm going to say over here, constant greet is equal to, and I say screen dot get by text. So what am I going to look for in the text? I'm going to simply ask the text that greet mark rendered. That's all I care about. So essentially, you are saying, let me know that particular content has been rendered. I'm going to talk about the get by in just a few minutes. Once we have this test passing, we'll come back to that. So I say expect greet to be in the document. So you're basically saying, just tell me that I found this in the document. That's all I want to know. That's what you're saying in here. So essentially, the test says, mark away the greet. I don't care about what's in it. Simply, if it was ever called, render the words greet mark rendered. Then we render the app component. We ask for the view to contain greet mark rendered, and then we are checking that it's in the document. That's all we are doing. And once I save it, you can see that my test already failed, because this keeps a watch on your files. And the minute your code is modified, your test execute. Now, just as a quick note, if you look in the dictionary for the word lazy, my photo is actually given in there. I am the laziest guy I know. I don't do things where I got to keep moving things around, lose focus. So typically, my work environment is literally this, just to give you an idea. So I would take this one right here, and in this particular case, let me try if it's going to move. And in this case, just to give you an idea, typically, as you can see, there's a reason why my background is transparent. Not because I can see the mountains. Well, that's part of it, but not entirely. It's partly because it's hard for you to see with the light in this room and the settings, but probably that shows you a little bit more. So as I'm coding, I can immediately glance at what's behind it. And so I don't have to keep moving around. So right here, I can be, as an example, right? I could be simply saying, to give an example, a false, and I could be just saving it. You can see the test we ran. It says what the failures are. So all I can do is keep an eye on it. I don't need to be fiddling with things. Just have a nice music playing in the background, keep writing code, sip your beverage, and keep the test passing. So this is one of the things you can do. Find your, preferred way of working. That's mine. I usually have these background windows for a reason, so I don't have to keep switching between things. I keep focus on the code, and I can keep seeing the test passing on the side. But for now, of course, it's really hard for you to see it right now. So I'll move it to a separate screen so you can see it much better in the lighting of this room. But in general, that's kind of the way I keep things around. So now that we wrote that, what's the next thing I'm going to do? I need to now have a greet. So I'm going to go ahead and touch here source greet.js. So notice I just only touched that file. I didn't write anything in that file. If you just are curious, that's an empty file. I don't have anything in that file. I just touched it to just create a new empty file. That's all I did. Then I say source app.js, and I'm going to say import right there, and I'm going to import the greet file. And what am I interested in from that file? I'm going to bring in a greet, and I want to bring in greet from the file greet.js. So of course, nothing exists in that file, right? So I'm saying go get that from the file, and I'm going to say go ahead and render greet for me right now. So I'm asking my app component to render my greet component. That's all I did. Notice the test is passing, right? But because you're just programming with intent, you're saying, I don't care about greet. And guess what? It's even better, right? Your buddy over there is actually writing the greet function. Your job is to integrate with it. The worst thing you want to run into is all the mess your buddy is creating right now. You're like, I don't care. My job is to render greet, not what it does. So you mark away, render it, you're home free, right? So that's basically what we did. We separated the concern at this point, and we rendered the greet. And in this case, just to illustrate this, just to be sure, I remove the rendering of the greet right now, and I go back, the test is failing, and I go back and render the greet right now again, and you can see the test is passing. So essentially, that's all we did. We said, I'm interested in rendering greet. I don't care about what greet is doing, end of story. So that finishes our first test. When I typically do test-driven development, what I do is, I'm a old school. I'm old school for a reason. I don't like to do context switching. Context switching is a great way to lose the flow. When I'm writing code, at some times it can be really risky. You switch context, and right at the time, your little brain tells you, wonder what somebody is tweeting. And you check the tweet, and somebody is saying something, and you have to argue with everybody on Twitter, right? And the next thing you know, 3 hours is gone, and you don't remember what you were trying to do. So I stay laser focused when I do things. Otherwise, you can almost never get anything done. So as a result, no emails, no Twitter when I do work usually. My schedule usually is I'll do emails in the morning and reply to important client emails, and I get into a flow. I wouldn't care to look at emails until lunchtime. And then I would look at emails during lunchtime, and then I would be not looking at emails until end of the day. So like 3 or 4 times in a day. If something is really important, they're going to call me, right? Otherwise, it can wait for the next day, wait for the second day. It's not a rush. And again, don't get me wrong. People always tell me, oh my gosh, I cannot believe you reply to emails so quickly. And there's a reason for it, because I know exactly when I reply to emails, right? So I don't forget things because that's the task and I focus on it. So for that reason here, when I'm writing these things, what I typically do is I always have a piece of paper, a little notepad next to me, and I have a pen. And as I'm thinking through the code I'm writing on the piece of paper, I am jotting down the test I want to write. And as I'm writing code, guess what? As I'm writing code, my brain says, oh, did you remember this edge case? You need to remember. I'm applying a coupon, and my brain says, wait a second, the coupon is expiring today, but the person applying this coupon is in Alaska, but my time is California time. What do I do? That's an important aspect to consider, because if you don't, you release your product, and the dude from Alaska sends a support call saying, what's up with you guys? You said the coupon expires today. It's only 9 p.m. in the night. I'm trying to apply this coupon. It doesn't work. Well, that's costly. But the beauty is when you're writing these test cases, my brain starts thinking through all these different scenarios, edge cases. What if this? What if that? And when those thoughts come to my mind, what's the worst thing you can do? Start modifying code for it, right? Don't do that. Immediately start jotting them down as test cases. Hey, coupon, a user using coupon is in Alaska. That's all I need to know in my test case. So I'm focusing on the test I'm working on. When I am done, what's the next test I want to work? Okay, that one. And then about the 10th test, oh, that person in Alaska, let me see how the time zone is being handled. So I start writing the test cases on a piece of paper. And then, of course, as I'm working on it, I take a pen and strike the test I finish writing. And you know what? Why that's so beautiful? After about an hour of work, your mind is like, gosh, I worked for an hour. And you look at this paper, and about 70% of them are checked away. And your brain says, you can do this, right? It feeds that energy saying, hey, this is awesome. I can write more of these test cases so you can focus on writing these test cases also. So keep a list of these along with what you're doing as you're working on it. So now that that's working, what do I want to do? I'm going to copy in here the app.test.js to greet.test.js. That file obviously did not exist, so I'm going to create it. So I go to the greet.test.js, and what am I going to say here? Bring in the greet from the greet, as you can see right there. And of course, I don't care about the mock. I definitely don't care about the canary test either, right? Because those two are not needed right now. The canary is just the one thing we write in the beginning. So what am I going to do? So I'm going to say greet renders, we can say an initial, let's say initial message. So what do I want to be the initial message? So I render greet right now. Then I say over here, we're going to say, initial message. So what is the initial message going to be? I'm going to simply say it's going to be right here. It's going to be, let's say, hello, let's say there. So essentially, it's going to say hello there. And I want to know that the initial message has been rendered. Now, let's stop on this one before we go any further. Now, what does this really do? It says I'm going to render the greet. And as soon as I render the greet, I want to be able to see the message that says hello there. Now, you can see a slash given right here. You can put a little I in front of it to say that you want it to be case insensitive. So you are saying, I don't care if the cases are mixed cases, I don't care about it. Or you can say, I want it to be, that case itself. So you have, things to vary on. Now, having said that, this one is a little bit of a extra redundant work, but don't hesitate to do so. So let me explain what that really means. Okay, by the way, I'm a huge fan of code coverage. If you ever work on my project, you will start hating me very quickly because I'm that person who comes and annoys you. What's a coverage? Why don't we have 100% coverage on this code? I care about coverage. The reason I care about coverage is I'm still waiting to be proven wrong on this. I never tell people to write tests when I find a poor coverage. Every time, this was a light bulb moment for me when I discovered it, and I've been waiting to be proven wrong for nearly about 10 years now. And that lesson I've learned is the following, and that is show me code with poor coverage. You have shown me a code that is crying for design refactoring. This has been the aha moment for me. I tell my developers, if the coverage is not 100%, we follow a rule of three as I say it. So what are the rule of three we follow? Rule one, rule two, rule three. Rule one, do it. Don't give me excuses. Don't give yourself excuses. Just do it. Write test, write code. And here's the thing to ask, right? If you write test and minimally write code, can anyone guess what the coverage will be? It shouldn't take this long. We're not talking to moon, right? 100%, right? You write test and write code minimally to make it pass, it's going to be 100%. So when programmers ask you, what is a good coverage number? For every programmer words, there's a translation in English, right? So the programmer speaks, what's the minimum coverage you think we should have? Let's translate to English. I wrote the code already. What can I do minimally to go home? Right? So that's basically an excuse path we are trying to talk to. No reason to. So rule number one, do it. Well, I don't know how to do it. You know what? It's perfectly okay not to know. Is there anybody in the room who was born knowing everything, right? I don't think so. I don't know a lot, but I don't have a problem saying I don't know, because the minute I say I don't know, there are three people around me who tell me, let me show you how to do this. Now I don't stay in that I don't know phase. So the second one is ask for help. So you don't know, well, you do it, you don't know how to do it, ask for help, right? Collaborate. Go to a developer and say, I'm working on this, I don't know how to make this coverage. Can we pair and work on it? Come to me. And I may say, I don't know either. And we both will go talk to somebody else at that point. And the third rule is get yelled at. So if you don't do it and don't ask for help, I'm going to yell and scream at that point. So developers would come over to me and say, hey, this code doesn't have coverage. Here you go. So you won't yell at me anymore because you know that I don't have coverage. And the minute they tell me this, I thought I would tell them, why don't you write another test? And I haven't said that in the past 10 years. That was the biggest surprise for me. But instead, I asked them, what's the code you are writing? And they open the code and show me where there's no coverage. And the minute they show me the code with poor coverage, we are like, oh, but that function is handling this condition over here. Do you think that is a tight coupling? Should we move this to a separate function? And the programmer is like, you know what, I didn't think of it, but that makes sense. Let me make a note of it. I'll work on it. More recently, I have a client that I'm working with right now. It's a financial company. And the boss had told this programmer, if the code has poor coverage, here is Venkat's contact, call him. This guy doesn't know who I am. So he calls me one day and says, hey, I have a poor coverage, and my boss saw it, and he said, go call Venkat. I don't know who you are, but here I am. I'm calling you because my boss said, if the coverage is poor, call him. And I said, okay, let's take a look at the code. Thanks for calling. And we're looking at the code. And then I said, oh, wait a minute. You're getting this property for this customer. And based on the property of the customer, you're making this decision. What if this customer has a different data? How does the code handle it? And remember, he called me because the coverage was poor. And my question is, if the data is different, how do you handle it? And he's like, oh, and then there's a silence. And then a few minutes later, he says, you know what? I never thought of it. But now that you mention it, if that is the data, this code will misbehave. You just found a bug. And I'm like, okay, so what do you think we should do? He's like, I'm writing it down. I'll fix that bug. Well, he wanted to talk about code coverage. We found a bug. And then now we are talking about, do you think this function should be doing all this work? That's an enormously complex piece of logic, only 10 lines still. And he's like, yeah, I was writing this and I was thinking about it when I was writing. If I move this into a separate function, I would remove that complexity from here. Then when I call this function, it's easier to read. And he's making a note. And about 15 minutes later, he's like, looks like I got work cut out. So thanks for that help. I'll get back to you if I need further help. And we never talked about testing at this point. And then a few hours goes by, and he sends me an email saying, hey, thanks for the tip. I started refactoring the code. I started fixing the bug. Along the way, I wrote some tests as I was doing these things, and my coverage is 100%, and it's working, so I don't need your help anymore. And that's the surprising part, is that if you put your effort into it, rather than freaking out on these metrics, if we ask the question, do they benefit us? How do they benefit us? Then we begin to embrace it a lot more. So in this case, one of the tenets I follow is the following. And that, so where I went that rabbit hole is, when I see programmers don't understand the why is extremely important, right? I mean, let me tell you this. There are people who don't, by the way, seat belts, wear it, right? I'm not kidding when I say this, wear it. You guys know the Nobel Prize winner who was in the Great Minds movie. He and his wife got killed about 7 or 8 years ago. They were not wearing seatbelt when they were in the back of a car. So why is there a seatbelt? Because it protects us when we get thrown off a vehicle. Now, what happens when you don't put a seatbelt? It makes that stupid noise. How many times have you seen people take a little piece of plastic and stick into that hole So the stupid machine won't ding on you. This completely defeats the purpose of why we need a seatbelt. Now, this is a rather, we are annoyed at the alarm and we lost sight of why that is there in the first place. And that is the key. You want to ask the question, why is there code coverage? If you understand that really well, you're going to do the right things. If you see the code coverage as a stupid seatbelt alarm, what are you going to do? You're going to shut that alarm down. And I have seen developers write tests with the zero asserts in it. And I look at the test, it calls the function and it's done. And go to the developer and say, why do you have this test? And they said, because the code coverage tool was complaining. I wrote this test and it's quiet now, right? That is sticking that plastic into that hole so the belt doesn't keep complaining. We need to understand why we are doing things, then we do the right things. Otherwise, we find all ways to go around it. So test should have an assert is generally a good rule. Now, the reason I emphasize that is this assert in this example is totally redundant. The reason it's redundant is the get function is telling you, I demand it. I know it is there, get it to me. If it is not there, that will throw an exception and it will fail. So it will never get to the next line if that line were to fail. So there are three types of methods that are available in the React library. So the React library has a get method, get something. There is a query method, query something. And there's a find method, find something. The names, these three names mean something different. The get function is synchronous. It'll get something. If it's there, it gives it to you. If it is not there, it'll blow up. So get to me now or blow up. That's what a get is. A query method will get it if it is there or return undefined if it doesn't exist. It won't blow up on your face. A find method is asynchronous. So you can use these variations based on what you're looking for. If you're looking for some text you know it's going to be there, just use the get. That's perfectly fine. You are done. Now, you can say, hey, I'm using a get. Can I get rid of the expect? Technically speaking, yes. Because if it's there, you're going to go to the next line. If not, it's going to blow up. But from the point of view of this rule we follow, that don't write a test without an assert, you normally put there just so that your brain doesn't go crazy. Oh my gosh, there's no assert in there. What are they doing? Okay, fine. The assert is there. They haven't really skipped it. So that's all the case in this particular situation is. So let's go ahead and save that away. And I'm saying hello there is what I want to see. Notice where the error is. The error is in the rendering of greet. It tells me, I don't know what you're trying to do. I don't know what to render in this particular case. So what are we going to do now? I'm going to go back here and edit the source greet.js. And I'm going to say in here, export default function. And I want to write that function. If you want to, you can put the word greet here, but nobody cares. Export, you can export a function with no name, an anonymous function, that's perfectly fine. So you're giving the greet function right now, and you're writing that, here I'm using a functional component. So then what am I going to do? I say return, and in the return, I'm going to simply return, and I will simply say here's a span, and I'll say hello, there is what I want to create, and I want to return it, right? So that's my greet component that I'm writing, and my test is passing. So we wrote a greet component. So what does the test look like? My test simply says, tell me when you render this, you see a hello there, and that's all it's telling me, right? So far, so good. Now, like I said earlier, it's a skill. That's what it really is. It's a skill. My first exposure to test-driven development was in the year 2003. It's kind of scary to think about it. It was almost this month, 20 years ago, I wrote my very first unit test. And before that, I didn't need tests because I wrote perfect code, you know that, right? And I never needed testing before that. Well, the point really is, I didn't realize you could actually write tests and run them repeatedly. And I rejected that like everybody else did. I said to myself, I don't need this stuff. I write my code, I write my test, everything is working. Why do I need this stupid thing called unit test? And then, of course, I realized sometimes you do stuff, but you don't realize it. And then I realized eventually I would write tests and make the code is working. And a few months later, the code has deviated from my test. And those tests are no longer useful. And anytime I had to make some changes, guess what I would do? I would write more tests. And that was a complete waste of time, but it never occurred to me. And when I came across unit test, I realized, oh my gosh, unit test is not that different from what I did, except those tests I wrote, I don't forget them. I run them continuously every day. So 6 months from now, when I want to add a feature, those tests are still there guarding me. So it's really putting value to the effort you already put in. And I started doing this, and it took me a while. But then once I understood the value, I'll absolutely be honest about it. Maybe it took me about 6, 7 years before I figured out how to write test cases. Like everybody else, if you're capable of writing bad code, anybody who's not capable of writing bad code? One person, right? No. Maybe the managers are not capable of writing bad code, right? Because they're not capable of writing any code, right? Okay, fine. But anybody who writes code is going to write bad code. If you're capable of writing bad code, guess what? You are as capable, if not more capable, of writing bad tests. And so the question is, how good is this test? And I would go to people, sit down and say, what do you think? And they're like, let's talk about the test you're writing. I would write test and look at my own test. And about 6 or 7 years later, I said, aha, let's rethink about how we write test cases. But that's a skill you develop. And as time goes on, you can carry that skill forward, right? So imagine if you take the time to develop that skill. In my case, which may not be your case, in my case, I took the time to develop that skill. Now I help my clients with that skill. I help myself with products I develop with the skill. There used to be a time when somebody paid me money to develop code. Today, I pay myself to develop my code. It was easy to waste my boss's money. It's hard to waste my family's money. I'm not saying my money, right? It's my family's money. And I have to answer to that question. That's even more difficult. So now I'm more careful. I want to write tests. The same way in your case, right? You may be a consultant like I am eventually. You can use that skill to help your clients. That's good for you and good for your clients. You may turn into an architect or a team lead or a manager. I had a technical manager who was as technical, if not more technical than I was. I had a mind blown. And I would look at him and said, how do you know this stuff? You're a manager, you're not supposed to know this. And he's like, yeah, that's right, but I do. And he would sit there and talk to me technically, and he would sit and work with me at the code level. But you could be that person, right? You can move up in your career where the skills go with you. That's the benefit. So now that we wrote this test, what do I do? What do I want to do next? Not what I want to do next is my next test is going to be to simply say, we will say in this case, display users user a name of the user. So you want to display the name of the user. Now, in a functional component, this takes a little bit of getting used to. In a functional component, they wanted to focus on the outcome, not on the implementation. That actually is really good, but it takes a while to get used to it. So what am I going to say here? I'm going to first of all render the greet component, right? So that's all I'm going to do first, render the greet component. Then I say constant input equal to, and in the case of this, you can say screen dot get by label text, and the label is going to be name. Let's start with this first and understand what this means. The get by label text is a really interesting function. It says in a HTML page, you have an input field, but next to the input field, you have a label field. I want to tell you the name of the label, but you get me the input field corresponding to that name. That's what this is saying. So the result is not a label, the result is an input. It's a bit misleading. Get by label text, it doesn't say get what by label text. Get input by label text. That's what it means. So now I got the input. I don't care to do an expect right now because the expect will never be reached if the get failed. But I'm going to do more work with it. I don't need an expect. So then what am I going to say? I'm then going to say over here, I want to be able to tell this input field that the user is going to type something into this particular UI. So I want to type something into the UI. How do I do that? So essentially for this, you can ask for what's called a fire event. So the fire event is an event you're going to process, and this is going to do different kinds of events that you want to provide. So in this case, I'm going to say a fire event dot, and what do I want to do in this case? A change. And what do I want to change? The input. And what do I want to send to this input as I change it? I'm going to provide for it a value, and the value is just a JavaScript object which contains a target, because a target is what a view is going to have. And that target is going to have a value, if you will, and the value is going to be Sam is the value I want to send to this particular object that I am sending. So this says, go ahead and type into that input field, simulating a user's interaction of typing something. Okay, so I did that. What's the next thing I want to do right after this? Then I'm going to say, well, once I fired the event, I want to click on a button, let's say in this particular case. So I'm going to say at this point, a constant button is equal to screen.get, in this case, by text, and we can say a click or whatever you decide to call it, right? You can say submit, click, update, whatever it is, right? So you're going to specify that name and you ask for it. Once I get the button, again, no need for an expect in this particular case, right? So then what are we going to do? Then we say constant greet is equal to screen dot, pardon me, fire event again, how did I forget that? Is a click event. And what am I clicking right now? I want to click right now the button. So you're simulating the user's clicking of a button at this time. Once you click on the button, I say greet is going to be a screen dot get by text. And what am I interested in getting? Hello, Sam is what I want to get. Remember, it was hello there. I want it to be hello, Sam right now. Then I say expect greet to be in the document. So essentially, you are writing the test for what your intention is for the action you want to perform. So this could be where a user is entering maybe their product ID number, and they click a button. Well, then you can say when the button is clicked, the details of that product are displayed for the user, right? Whatever that could be, you can write the test for it. So now that you wrote that particular test, obviously you want the test to fail right now, and the test is failing. What's the problem with the failure? It says, I don't know what your label is. So notice the error. It says get by label text name. I don't know what that is. You're like, okay, no problem. Now I'm going to edit the source, greet right there, greet.js rather, and let's edit that particular file right now. So what are we going to do in that particular in that particular file? I'm going to say right there is the hello there. Let's put a little br, and I'm going to say in here a label, pardon me, a label, and this label is HTML for, and it's going to be a name, and I'm going to say name, and that's going to be the label. Then I say input ID equal to name, so I'm going to say this is the name, and then I say in here, so notice in the code I use an uppercase name. So what the library does is it finds the label with the name given here, then looks for the HTML for and the name with the ID. That's how it connects it, and then gives you the input, right? So in this case, I have a name, type is equal to text, and what do I want to do here? I'm going to say over here, that is my input I'm interested in receiving right there. Now look at the error. Did that move on? It moved on to the button, didn't it, right? So one step at a time. Like I said, as I'm writing it, I can see this on my window in the background. So I know I'm progressing through it. Minimally, I can write code for it. So then what am I going to do as a next step? I'm going to create over here maybe a BR, and then I'm going to simply say that I want to provide a button where the button is going to be a click button, an end of the button. So that's the button I'm going to create. And you can see that's running through. And now it's in the hello Sam. So you can see that progress forward as you are moving ahead with this. So that is basically what you're doing here is one step at a time that you are doing in this particular case. So then what's the next step? Well, obviously, I want to enter something into the text, and the user may say that I don't want this, or they may come back and update on it later on. So now I'm going to say import, and I'm going to say this is going to be use state, and this is going to be from React. So we bring that in. So again, there's many ways to design it. So you can decide what you want to do. So we could say in this case, you could say input, maybe a text, and then you could say comma set to text, or whatever you want to call it. We could say use state is going to be the empty state. You could then say here comes a name, and there is a set name that I'm going to provide there as well, which is empty as well. So then I go back to the input, and in the input I'm going to say on change is equal to, what am I going to change? E arrow, and this is going to be the set text, and to the text I'm going to set e dot target dot value. Remember, that's what I used in the test, right? The target value, and I'm going to set the text to it. Then I'm going to say to the button, I can say on click is equal to, what am I going to do when you click on it? I'm going to, when you click on it, I'm going to say set name and take the text and set the name on that one. One final step, obviously, I go back to the hello there, and what am I going to say? In this case, I can simply change it to there, pardon me, not that, this one, for the name, and I can simply say hello and change it to a name like so. So once I change it to a name, I can then take a look at it, and the test is passing, as you can see. So you control your code. You don't let your code control you, right? You got a command of what you do when you can methodically progress further. So we wrote the test and said, I'm going to enter this into the input. I'm going to click the button. I want to see the result. Now you can change this implementation 1,000 ways you want to. Doesn't matter. It's an implementation detail. You can say, oh, Venkat, there's a better way to implement this code. I'm like, thank you, bring it on. You know why? My test is still passing. I can refactor it to anything simpler as many times as I want to. Make it work, make it better real soon. So we can keep evolving the code by writing these test cases. But the rest of the idea is not very different moving forward. You can continue to write more test cases. You can check for asynchronous interaction. I want to make a call to a service, stub away or mark away your service using jest. And now when your component makes a call to the service, the mark will be called very much like what you saw when I marked away the component that I'm rendering. So every step of the way, if you don't know how to do, and I'll leave you with this word that I tell myself, this is not an insult about anybody, right? So this is what I tell myself all the time, and it's so liberating when I tell this, and that is, do not confuse your inability with the impossibility. So if I don't know, if I say, I don't know, that's liberating. The minute I say, I don't know, he's like, hey, in my previous job, we did something like this. Let me show you how we do it. Like, thanks. Now I learned something. Or he says, I don't know either. And as we are talking, she hears it and says, but wait a minute, I've done something like this. Have you tried this? And now we have an answer. If I said it's impossible, that's end of the story. Let's go home, right? It's grim. So if you don't know how to do something, tell yourselves, I'm going to figure it out because it only makes you stronger. Hope that was useful. Thank you.